It's time for discussion with the audience. I personally recognize quite a few people. I understand there are people coming from many different places in organizations in Sweden and from the United States, from Italy, our guests, and from Panama even, I know. So could we start a discussion? We have an extremely busy state secretary who has to leave.
At 3.
Oh, at 3, wonderful. Okay, so we won't press it.
We'll start it.
Yeah, but could we open the floor for discussion? Is there anyone who would like to pose a question to the people who have been speaking today? It's always hard to start. Can I ask you?
Thank you. My name is Rudolf Kleveringa, Global Water Partnership, supported by the government and other partners here in Sweden. I'll cut straight into the matter. With Leonard, some years in Rome, and of course rural development was our business. Question to the Secretary of State, Ulrika. There was a statement made on land and natural resources governance. And that they must evolve and be made inclusive. Now, I understand that to be somewhat of inclusive of all of society, but at the same time, all of these institutions are highly fragmented and separated, and keep being so because it seems lacking to ensure an accolade amongst the, if you want, a common denominator between the land and natural resource governance institutions. What are all of the institutions that we here represent doing? Yeah, and how are we doing to, say, consolidate that landscape and avoid fragmentation so that farmers like Charlotte here don't have to go and talk to 26 organizations, yeah, but maybe to a lesser number that she selects. Thank you.
We could try it this way or a stand. Either way.
Should I answer directly?
Or we could.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 more questions. It's usually a little bit easier. Yeah.
I'm Sarah Stenhammar. I work at Sida. You talked about increased production, and I would like to know how to go about that. And I'm thinking of chemicals. Are you going to use a lot of chemicals, and how will that, what effects will that have, also of negative kind, and especially for poor people who deal with them and perhaps not protected enough, etc.? So how do you accomplish sustainable agriculture?
And yet another question?
Mats Denier is my name. I have some few decades of background in with agriculture and rural development in Africa. I'm a farmer, a slotter basically. And I just also would like to acknowledge an excellent report, and also conclude that already back in the 80s and in the 90s, when I was the head of the Sida Regional Land Management Unit, we concluded that exactly at Leonard today, how can we move from 1 to 5 tons? That was in an African agriculture context, and that is now 20 years ago. The share of the Swedish development, the share of finances of the Swedish development support budget has varied. We can discuss the details, 1 or 2%, but 5, 6, 7, probably 8%, depending on how you assess that. Obviously, we still have, after decades with the same analysis, we still have some work to do in supporting this transformation and this change. So very brief question to Ulrika or others and Paul or Lennart who would like to respond to that is, would this IFAD report give impetus to any policy changes with regard to support to the agricultural and rural sector? Thank you.
If I could make one comment, we have via internet, the embassy in Mali, and we welcome you. I don't know if we can see you a little bit. Any questions from you could perhaps go through internet. I don't know if you have a microphone. I don't. I'm sorry. Anyway, wave if you want to come in contact with us. We'll work it out. Would you like to? I hope that works.
Okay. Is it on? Yes, it is. Well, I mean, we have been talking about, and I was also commending IFAD for relating the different development goals, and how do we then make the institutions come together, that is in our own country, but also globally. And I think that we now are in the middle, or actually we should be at the end of a very important process within the UN family now with the QCPR, and the UN as one of the important systems for delivering on the Agenda 2030 needs to see how it can actually see to that the funds and programs deliver in a much more coordinated way. And there, of course, the QCPR, yes. I should explain what it is, of course. Yes. Yeah. So it's a revision of how the UN system coordinates its actions, done every 4th year, and of course now very important, as we should see that the UN system, it's not only the UN system that needs to deliver on the Agenda 2030. We know that it's much more than that. It's policy coherence, it's the private sector, and so on. But of course, if the UN funds and programs cannot deliver, then it will be much more difficult to promote other actors to see to that they deliver. And Sweden, we have been sharing a group, which is called the Utstein Group, where we have pushed for the different funds and programs to really see to that they get the act together. But as always within the UN system, it's the member states that actually decide. And we are quite worried now that the member states do not see the full importance of really delivering now on a much more coordinated system. But we are pushing, and we hope that we will get more countries to push, and not least the G77 that we think should really see the importance of making way for the funds and programs to deliver. How we have a more sustainable agriculture, I mean, this is what the agenda is about, and I'm not the expertise, but I can see always when we discuss this about the increased productivity and the relation to sustainable productivity, that there is a lot of engagement from different researchers here in Sweden, and my hope is that the expertise can see that the agenda really should provide an instruction for how to make our increased productivity also sustainable, also with regard to chemicals. So then I hope that I have someone here that can explain how this could and should be done, because this is what we have said. And then the finance of this. I mean, this is also about interlinkages, and that's why I also mentioned, and I was happy to hear that you have been thinking about it as well. I mean, how do we see that other funds for development and for climate finance can actually be supportive to this process? We see a lot of interest in climate finance because of the importance that climate finance has had in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement. But we are worried, and we want to take leadership and see to that climate finance actually is really supportive to this process and the kind of recommendations that you also see in the report. And I think that this is something that we can take lead on and talk much more about. How do we do this? Because of course climate finance, when it comes to adaptation, has a lot to do with agriculture and the kind of findings that you have presented in the report.
Paul, I'll go after you.
On the question of increasing production without chemicals, etc. I mean, we mostly leave it up to countries on how they're going to manage the pesticides, etc. But within our projects, extension agents use integrated pest management and are trying to do it in such a way that you're looking at all the options, and pesticides, chemical fertilizers might be an option, but we're trying to do it to avoid that to the degree possible. As a practical example, in one of the projects, they give recommendations, and they have a green list, which are all the cultural practice, rotation, et cetera, tillage. And then there's a yellow list that does include some chemicals, but with warnings on how to use it, et cetera. And then there's a red list of things they should never use because they're too toxic and they're not supposed to be in the country even, but somehow they slip in. So the approach is to recognize that that there's this downside of using these chemicals, but without being so dogmatic that we can't say, no, you shouldn't use that. And partly that's up to the countries, since we do loan to countries and they ultimately make those decisions. In terms of the impetus for support in the rural sector and what the report does, I mean, partly this is part of the evolution of IFAD. We've been moving in this direction, and this is kind of solidifying what we've already been doing. But I think a lot of it, our president has talked about in the past, the president of IFAD, we did, poverty management in some ways, in that we were helping the poor, but we weren't transforming their situation. And I think there's a lot of approaches, including ones like microfinance, that have been shown to be very helpful, but really don't get people out of poverty ultimately. And we're trying to shift more to thinking, what will it actually do? And I don't think this is just us. This is a broader agenda. How do we graduate people out of poverty? There's the BRAC studies in Bangladesh and elsewhere, where they showed that asset transfer has this amazing potential to get people out of poverty. And I was on a panel on the Rural Development Report in London a couple of days ago, and the person that did the study was on the panel, and she said ahead of time she believed it wasn't going to work. And she was hired from the London School of Economics to do the analysis, and to her surprise, it had a 22% return on the investment. And so it was a great way of getting people out of poverty. And I think that this report and just the general idea and the SDGs really make us think, are we just making life not worse, or are we actually making life better? And to try to think of how can we invest in things to make it better.
So these were three big questions, right? Let me take an additional stab to it here. When it comes to institutions, I mean, your challenge there is huge, of course. But I think the increased attention given to tenure and to institutions, etc., in rural development is very important. So far, I think there's been a little bit of wishful thinking, and we had a similar seminar here a couple of years ago, specifically on those programs, and there is still very not enough known about its implications for development, if you like, welfare, economic efficiency, etc. So I think we're only at the beginning of both how these will be managed institutionally and supported externally, but also the role they have in development. So it's well taken, but yeah, we should put much more effort on that. On sustainable agriculture, I think you're coming from a Swedish perspective, and this is a big deal here. I think in the international, for example, we had a UN expert panel on sustainable agriculture a couple of years ago, and when it comes to researchers and practitioners, it's much less contentious than what the Swedish debate shows. Everybody really believes that you need to invest in the soils, you need more organic material, but you also need chemical fertilizer. And actually there's a very strong correlation between the two. The more organic carbon you have in the soils, the more return you get from your usual fertilizers. Then when it comes to more pesticides and so on, of course we need to be very careful. But in terms as part of the investment program, it's not so contentious as it seems to be in Sweden. Mats, yes. What is very, very sad, of course, when you look at not only Swedish development systems, but many other countries too, and the countries themselves, is that despite the fundamental role of agriculture in these countries, in the economies, and for welfare, the rate of investment has gone down. Now, G8 tried to address this a couple of years ago, and there is, evidence with Gates Foundation and also greater awareness that this is turning around. But you're absolutely right that there has been underinvestment in the sector, which has been very detrimental, I believe. There is a similarity with kind of the integrated rural development approach of the 70s and what we are talking about now. But I think the perspective that we have now of more of these kind of transformations in society goes a little bit beyond all kind of the inputs, outputs that were considered in the integrated rural development programs in the 70s. And I hopefully, as I kind of try to nudge at the end of my little discussion there, hopefully this will make it more interesting for governments to follow, the kinds of approaches that you've seen in China, and seriously starting to see, well, what do we need to invest and even transfer to the rural sector to make sure that they are actually part of this transition and to ensure that we have sustainability in these land uses, because in the end we are all dependent on not only the food, but also the water and the air and, all these ecosystem services that comes out from the proper management of the rural areas. So, thank you.
Lotta, could I ask you, do you have anything to say on that?
I think that you can increase the agriculture in an easy way with the right knowledge also, because you have to start when the farmers who need to increase are. 4 weeks ago, I met a dairy farmer in Bolivia, and we start to have exchanges about dairy farming in Sweden. And he asked, "Oh, what do you have? Must have a really super breed that why your cows can milk so much." But then we have to start talking how much food we gave the cows. So you have to start with the knowledge at the right level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We'll take another set of questions. I know that Ola Möller has a question to start, and then you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ola Möller. I work here at Sida as Senior Policy Advisor. I have a question. Thank you again for the presentation on the report and the reflections. Most interesting. So far, a lot of the discussion has been focusing on the production side, the rural areas, the production and of food, but basically the crops. Not so much has been talked about the quality of what we are producing. A lot has been talked about the quantity. We need to increase the yields and so on. But I think it's also important to remember the quality aspect. Just to produce twice, 3 times, or 4 times as much of the same staple crop is a poverty trap, in my opinion. You need to look at the quality aspects as well. And linked to that, I think we have this Development Goal 12, sustainable consumption. And my question is, what do you as panelists think, could this be a pull factor? We have talked about the push factors to enabling environment at the rural areas for transformation, but what can be pull factors? Can sustainable consumption, can people who put demands on quality and so on, how can they affect this development? And if they can, how do you think they can be a pulling factor for this transformation? Not an easy question, but still it's interesting to hear your reflection.
My name is Linda Engström. I'm a PhD student at the Agriculture University in Uppsala. I have a question to all of you, I think. It's how you see the role of large-scale agriculture investment in rural transformation. I know that, for example, many governments in sub-Saharan Africa still have goals to develop a lot of large-scale agriculture, and Sweden is also part of supporting this. So I see, what do you see the role of? How do you see the role of large-scale agriculture in rural transformation?
Thank you so much.
Were you before or she was before?
Yeah, my name is Golia Kimanzo. I work for the International Department of Salvation Army here in Stockholm. I've also been involved in road development for a long time. Peter, actually, it was interesting to hear you talk about transformation and inclusive growth. For instance, you quoted Bolivia. And I know you gave a very good example in Kenya too, of the dairy value chain. But my worry is that there are all these bureaucrats from IMF and the World Bank that sit in the central bank in Kenya, and they are looking at the policies of all these governments. How do you ensure that your very good policy prescriptions really have an influence on the probably World Bank and IMF that actually have much more influence on the agriculture policy, especially in sub-Saharan Africa? And we know the long history of the structural transformation in prescriptions that really were very detrimental to the development of agriculture in those countries.
Perhaps one more question?
Thank you for the presentations. I'm Lise Benoit. I'm an intern at the Stockholm Environment Institute and a master student at Uppsala University. I have actually a question on the broader framework, so to say, because I felt like economic growth and increased productivity was at the very center of all this project and all this, this rural development. But at the same time, you also mentioned climate change, and I think we all know that there cannot be an infinite economic growth on a finite planet. And so I was wondering, I wanted to have your opinion on the degrowth society model, but not only from the economic perspective, but also like this really the society change that goes along. And if there were project related to rural development that were thought like outside of this grow or die framework, if that was done or...
Sorry, which framework?
The grow or die framework.
Rule or die?
No, grow or die.
Grow or die, sorry.
Yes,
grow.
so
grow.
Yes, outside of this economic growth goal. Yes, I think that's it.
Yes, I know, yes. The microphone is there, yeah.
Thank you. Very briefly, but I mean, with regard to economic growth and growth within the sector and also large-scale production, I do think that we have, as was said also by Paul, to look at the dialogue and the national ownership. I mean, we will not be able to tell what to do, but we are able and we have the responsibility to have a strong dialogue. And I think that the framework of the Agenda 2030 is the framework that we have decided upon, and that gives us a great possibility, I think, to discuss the different aspects of sustainability that belongs also to this area. And I think, therefore, it is so important that we start to use the framework as a platform for both political dialogue, but then, of course, also between ministries and agencies and experts and so on, to make it a framework that we really make good use of, and the knowledge that has built that framework. So that should be, when we talk about policy prescription, that should be the kind of policy framework, of course, and the kind of prescription that we have already, or our political leaders all over the world have decided upon. And then, I mean, the area of growth and eternal increasing growth, I think this is a good point also in relation to the Goal 12 and responsible consumption, where we, of course, have a lot of responsibility in our own country, and also can show on what this kind of responsibility gives with regard to possibilities. And I think, as was said, I mean, Swedish farmers also look on different new areas of developing their companies and their way of working, and this is, of course, a possibility. The area of tourism is growing a lot, even though we know that tourism also brings a lot of traveling, which is one of the main problems with climate-related aspects. But there are really important possibilities that comes with the responsibility of the Goal 12 and in relation to the important area of growth and the backsides of growth. But of course, I mean, when we talk about the concept where we work on with development cooperation, growth is needed, and what we need to see is how we make economic development sustainable in our own countries.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Gunnar, could I just say one second? I know that State Secretary Ulrika Modéer must leave, but I wanted to say that you just mentioned the responsibility for strong dialogue. And having you here with us is strong dialogue. So thank you so much for that.
So we just had a seminar a workshop last week, bringing kind of the themes from planetary boundaries together with the people from Stockholm Resilience Center, but really looking at the policy aspect of that for a science article, and that really brought out, the lack of congruence, if you like, between, on the one hand, we're starting to get to know more and more about what the limits are in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, but also the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, right? But we don't really have the same thing on the policy agenda. We don't have the equivalent to kind of the planetary boundaries. It's kind of leaning into it in terms of climate change with the IPCC, but it's not strong enough. And for the other of the boundaries, we don't have it at all, really. So I think this is exactly the kind of framework that needs to be brought into a report like this. It's a further constraint. It's far from impossible. And actually, carbon sinks, for example, and also nitrogen sinks, etc., is possible to combine with a lot of the technologies that we're talking about here. But they need to be targeted from the very beginning. So that's the constraint you have to put into it. And that kind of leans over to some of these other questions also, both when it comes to large-scale agriculture, but also particularly the value change and the demand for higher value product. So in my Ethiopian example, 20 years, 4 times, the value added, which means that you cannot do that just by a productivity increase. You have to have a value increase too. And there are really, really exciting things happening now in terms of those value changes and outsourcing schemes, etc. So by design, this can be done, but you have to have a keen eye. Just like this report says, it doesn't come automatic if you want to have inclusiveness, but there are really, really good examples where you involve people in increasing that value added and doing it in a responsible way. When it comes to the large-scale farming, there are a lot of expectations on technology spillovers to farms around. I haven't seen as much of hard facts on that. There might still be, and that also reminds me of another issue, and that is there have been a couple of other seminars here with the Royal Academy of Agriculture and Forestry on the scenarios for increased, of course, need for food, but also fiber and fuel. And what we haven't really talked about so much today is, the competing uses and the needs to institutionalize some kind of reconciliation between these competing uses. And we see this big time in Ethiopia today, and it won't be easy, but it's extraordinarily important if we are to be successful.
I hope I don't misunderstood you, because you can also produce quantity with quality. It's not one way or another, no. And I think if you look at Sweden, you can see we need both small scale and also big scale farming, because we need the bulk, and we also need the small scale who create the value, who make the interest for the consumers to wake up. And I think for long term, you have to have policies that help the farmers and not depend on if you are big or small. You have to have a strong policy so you can develop from where you are. I think that's most important, because if you have policies which are not so strong, you will not put money in your business. You will not develop it because it takes too much.
So on the first question, I think part of the point of your question is that for a long time we fixated on smallholder agriculture and staple crops, trying to think, can we increase yields of rice, wheat, corn, potatoes, etc. And I think that fixation at one time might have made sense, but we've long since passed that. And we should focus on quality and quantity of high-value products. And that's part of these value chain projects, which for us are 70% of our projects now, where you're trying to see where are the market opportunities, how can we produce those, like the dairy project I mentioned, and how do we get more value out of what we're doing, either in the same crop or a different crop. But it's more fixating not on what's the productivity of this crop, but what are the opportunities, and can we take advantage of those opportunities. And that gets to the second part of your question on sustainable consumption. If people are consuming in such a way that they're demanding products, then we'll produce those products in our projects, right? So I do think that it matters, and you are seeing these emerge more in developing countries where people are interested in organic products and other types of nutritious products, and that helps drive opportunities. So I do think it matters what people's choices are being made. In terms of large-scale agriculture, obviously we focus on smallholders, so we think in terms of that model. My personal view is it depends on the circumstances. There was someone who just spoke at IFAD 2 weeks ago, and they basically said the evidence on large-scale agriculture that is available, which isn't a lot, is that it gives a boost of employment at the beginning, but then it drops pretty dramatically afterwards. Particularly if it's pure vertical integration, meaning that it's a company that owns this huge amount and it's not any sort of contract farming. So to me, I don't see why governments wouldn't do a careful analysis to see what the options are. And one option is contract farming or some other type of model, which is likely to have broader benefits than that model. So it really just depends. But I wouldn't have a knee-jerk reaction that it's bad, but to analyze it and think what among the options are best. In terms of the policy dialogue, yes, it is. The policies are often not consistent with what IFAD's trying to do, but I think they have moved at least the World Bank has moved in a better direction, and they do think about the issues that we think of as well in terms of small-scale agriculture. To me, the real issue is that they're less and less involved in agriculture. Not that they're doing anything bad, but they're just not doing anything. You mentioned Justin Lin talking about urbanization, right? The former chief economist, the current chief economist, ran a center on urbanization before he got the job, Paul Romer. And so he basically is trying to, herd everyone into shanty towns, as far as I'm concerned, and export poor people from rural to urban areas. That, to me, is not a successful policy. But the real risk is they just ignore the sector. And I think that's the real concern about the policy. We are more and more focused on policy engagement at IFAD, and part of that, as someone was mentioning over lunch, is getting lessons from the field and talking to people like the World Bank saying you should invest here. And we've done that in Peru, I think, and to provide opportunities, because we're small, right? We can't go to scale, so we try to leverage that. And then part of it is knowing what they're doing and seeing how we can work with that. If they're building infrastructure, which isn't necessarily for agriculture, but can be beneficial, then we can put in a project there.
Can I defend the bank for a sec? Being a World Bank consultant and all. In Ethiopia, actually the World Bank is the main driver of this kind of sustainable land management program and rural development program. So maybe it depends on the country. And I wish that Sida would actually take some ideas from the World Bank when it comes to the natural resource sector.
Thank you. I see we have just a few minutes. Could I ask Thomas Roswald to? I'm sorry, I didn't see you. And you too.
Which one?
Thomas was first. I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Okay, thank you. Thomas Roswald, I'm chair of Sida's Research Council, and I've also many years been chair of the Climate Change Agriculture Food Security Program, where we work a lot with IFAD. There is a lot of knowledge out there. I'm very proud that Sida is supporting capacity development and science in the least developed countries, many of them. But how do we get the information out to the farmers? There is a lot of knowledge out there, but the extension services in most countries is not functioning. I know the Swedish Farmers Federation complained that they don't see professors out on the farms any longer or out in the fields. So how do we do that? How do we get all the information that we have out to the farmers?
good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sepper Musavi. I'm a Sustainability Director for company Plantagon and the chair to the Swedish Committee for Sustainable Urban Food Production. I've been also working for the United Nations Environmental Program for a project called Resource Efficient Cities. And it was really interesting to see that on that project for the first time that we had a meeting when we talk about Goal 11 and Goal 12, of course, sustainable cities and communities, and then sustainable production and responsible consumption. We never talk about where this food is consumed. And societies which are like very much developed of importing a lot of food, like Sweden, for example, that no matter how much agriculture goes down in GDP, for example, people would never be hungry because we have the power to afford to import the food. How would countries like us, instead of like funding our cheap supply of food that we're importing and sometimes lack of this knowledge that we have, to transfer to those areas? Because, I mean, when we talk about carbon footprint and climate change, and 40% of that coming from the food industry, which is a result of this kind of like unsustainable production systems, what's our role in building this sustainable and resilient society that could feed itself, sometimes with more production in traditional way, sometimes with more production in industrial symbiosis, as we see today a lot of new products which are coming to the Swedish market and so on. What's your input in the role of the developed world when we have enough infrastructure and input to also be a bit more food secure by our own resources?
Thank you. I'm afraid we'll stop the questions here and ask for it.
Okay, so then I'll start. Ulrika has left. So first of all, on extension, thank you for that question. It's extraordinarily important, and it's such an institutional failure. We have a couple of projects where we look at, this yield gap. Why do farmers not get the relevant information? So I think this is one area, and the report, if you look at it, has a cautious approach. It talks about the importance of extension, but not necessarily the way it has been. Maybe you should talk about the report instead. Which I think is valid. I think there is an incredible potential today in using, as we have heard about, the mobile phones, etc. And we should really put much more effort in providing small farmers with the relevant information, not least in the perspective of climate adaptation. It has fantastic opportunity for increased productivity and rural livelihood, but not necessarily in the old ways, but look at it in a critical way. Then if I get on the question about, if I would interpret you, we've been talking about structural transformation in the countries. Now you're talking about the global almost, and what is our role in Sweden? And we heard on the radio yesterday about the concern, the Swedish agricultural system during war, etc. I think you talked about the price of food, and there was a very interesting reaction from the Minister of Agriculture in I think it was Indonesia or Malaysia during the food price hike. He said, "Fine for our rice, and we can start to invest." If you look at the long-term trend in terms of food markets, they've been basically downward sloping, right? I would like to see us pay more for our food and rely more on these developing. That's one of the few things that they can actually produce competitively, and if we could really pay the full price for that, and if they could elaborate, as we've been saying, in terms of the value added, I think that's a much better approach for kind of global development than us trying to pull back and see what we can do that. It's not really a resource constraint today. It's more of a global distributional constraint. That's what I would say.
I'm afraid we're so tight on time. Could you please? Thank you so much. Yes.
But I can continue on your question, because we have to still keep on reminding the politicians how important it is to focus and develop rural areas. Otherwise, we have no farmers, we have no food, we have no future. And I will, when I meet people who is in this, which are decision makers, I sometimes ask them, if we build a fence around Stockholm and nothing gets out and nothing gets in, which side do you want to be on?
There you go.
Gunnar's already the question about the information to farmers, in the sense that you're right, there's extension services. There's two problems. One, a lot of them don't have extension services at all. They've been decimated. The other is they have extension services and they do nothing, because they're basically giving them a salary, but they have no money. And so until another project comes along, they are sitting around. I think we need somewhere in between, where they're not wasting money just keeping people employed, but being a little more clever about how they manage to use extension. The training and visitation model that still a lot of them do, where they go out to farms, they spend all this time out there, is too expensive. And they need to use technologies to be more clever in the way that they transmit information, and combinations of different types of things. It is a big problem. So in our projects, quite often we have to go and find an NGO that can do the work for us, because there is no extension service. And so it is an issue, but you have to think about it carefully and come up. They're going to be broader than simply someone going out and talking to farmers. You have to build on that. On this question, I'm not sure how to answer, since as noted, we're promoting agriculture in developing countries among smallholders. Precisely, they can take advantage of markets, right? Including abroad. Coffee is produced in a lot of these countries, and it's a huge, important commodity. And if you guys quit drinking coffee, it doesn't help, right? It's causing problems. But there is, I assume here too, the locavore movement, right? To buy things locally and to purchase things locally. In my view, part of the problem with that is that it often creates these people think buying locally is somehow environmentally more sustainable, but it quite often isn't. If you buy a tomato from California, it actually produces more carbon than one from Central America, because it's mechanized. And so it can create these weird actions that don't actually make sense. My view as an economist, not as IFAD, is you get the prices right. We should tax carbon, and then we would know what the actual cost is, and we would be purchasing things based on the cost, including the cost of the environment.
What a way to end the day. Thank you. That's amazing.